So if there was a single hand that could sum up my experience on GG, this would absolutely be it. Hey guys, Ben Ababi here, and welcome back to the 10th episode of Road Back to High Stakes. So before we get into the graph and the hands this week, I just want to cover a little bit of admin. I'm traveling to the UK and I'm going to be there for 4 months. So I'm not sure what the content's going to look exactly like during that period, but there will definitely be some poker stars, hand histories I'm sure that I'll be reviewing, then also GG and ACR, but no Ignition, which as we've known after the past few weeks, we're okay not playing on Ignition at the moment. The only other thing to mention, and huge shout out to Gazzy B for hooking me up, I have been given permission to vlog at the Victoria Casino in London. Hopefully we'll be able to get some live content for the channel, maybe some 510, hopefully even some 1025 would be awesome. So I will definitely keep you posted on that in the coming weeks. But now on into the graph for the week. So I know last week we had a very plain sailing week, and this week it has not been the opposite, I would say, but definitely it has been a lot harder to get anything going. So as we can see, in the past couple of weeks, we played about 10,000 hands and we lost about $13,000. And as some people have reminded me in the comments, these 4 to 10k hand samples are meaningless. And I just want to reiterate, I do know that. But part of my process of sharing my results transparently over the years has been sharing my graphs, whether or not that's over long samples or short samples. And hopefully, in the not so distant future, I will be showing a very cool graph of about 3.5 million hands and hopefully a large profit number. But you're going to have to wait for that one and see if I can actually reach that goal. And here is the graph in big blinds, just so we don't leave anything out. We did lose about 18 binds on the week, had a pretty consistent loss rate over those days. So into today's hands, and we have got some special ones today. We've got a 400 big blind pot versus an unknown player on Ignition. We have got an absolute blow up from a brand new recreational to the GG pool, who I actually thought may have been a reg. And we have 2 hands versus the same player in the 1k GG pool. The first setting up the narrative for the second, where I receive one of the worst bad beats of my career. So the first and very spicy hand this week is Ace-3 offsuit in the big blind. Now we get limped from a new player and they're from Macau. No one was Jesus seating them, which usually means that they're not a recreational. And generally speaking, if a new player sits and they're from Macau, they're often not a recreational if they're open sitting the tables. So I was treating this player as somewhat a reggy-ish player. With that in mind, I do ISO sometimes, and I'm going to check sometimes, and this time we do check. Flop top pair on Ace-King 7 monotone. I think the standard play here is probably just to check back, but I don't mind betting sometimes as well. This is one of those times that I do go ahead and bet. Villain very quickly raises to 4x here. Definitely not in love with this spot, but we do have top pair in a limp pot where ranges are very wide, and I am always going to call. Feeling a lot better about the situation now after we turn trips and we face a very quick 75% pot on the turn. Nothing else to do here but call. Obviously, if they had flushes on the flop, we have now got plenty of outs. That is definitely one of them if they did have a flush, and we are expecting to see a number of checks or bets and just expecting to trot most of the time. Villain then almost snap shoves as quickly as they check raise the flop and bet at the turn. Obviously now I'm just going to call and chop, assuming that this player is somewhat of a reggy player. And on this occasion, we have somehow had the worst read of all time, thinking this player might be a reg, when in actual fact, they are just an absolute whopper. So here we are on Ignition, and we are 200 big blinds deep with MP, who opens for minimum. Now, my reads on this player were that I'm pretty sure that they weren't a big recreational, but I don't know if they were like some kind of tight recreational or maybe a reg. But they do open for minimum, and I go ahead and 3-bet 12 big blinds. I guess there is some argument here to making it a bit bigger, but I think the sizing versus minimum is definitely going to be okay. We see 8-5 deuce rainbow. I think there's going to be some medium-sized betting here, like half pot, and then there's going to be some very big betting as well. I think I'm just going to approach this spot with a half pot strategy, and I do think my hand wants to bet most of the time, but also pocket aces is going to be one of those hands that does want to mix in a check in there occasionally. This is one of those times that I do decide to check. When we do check and in position does stab, I think at 100 big blinds we may want to start developing some calls here, but when we're deep, I think we're going to increase our raising frequency. With that in mind, I decide to raise my hand every time versus what seems to be a relatively unknown player. And hands I'm going to be bluffing here are going to be some combos of ace-king, ace-queen, maybe some ace-4, those kind of hands. I don't think we're going to get to raise here with hands like jack-10. I think that's going to be a little bit on the thin side being this deep. 100 big blinds is definitely going to be a thing though. Now we see a 3 of clubs giving us a gut shot. I definitely don't see any reason to start checking our hand. The only straight that has filled up is ace 4, and we do double block that. I think as for sizing, I wouldn't mind seeing myself go half pot or 2/3 pot. Generally speaking, in these situations, I'm maybe a little bit too rigid, and I tend to err on the side of half potting rather than sizing up. When in position calls, I think it's very fair to say that they have a whole host of 1 pair hands here. Very rarely are going to have a straight, obviously for the reasons I said. They're going to have mostly pocket 10s through pocket jacks, some 9s, some queens. They're going to have plenty of 7-6, and then they're going to have loads of 5 out hands like 5-6 and 8-7. Then there's going to be a sprinkling of those kind of flush draws as well, which some of them now do fill up. It depends really what you think in position is going to bet call the flop with. I don't think there's going to be any king queen of clubs, but this is ignition and we have obviously all seen crazier things happen, so I wouldn't be surprised if that is in the range. As for my range here, I definitely don't want to be checking much of my range at all. I think my range on the king specifically, now that a lot of my bluffs fill up, I think our sizing scheme is going to be exclusively block and then all in. Block for hands like pocket queens, I would guess. Jacks is maybe a little bit too thin to block, but certainly queens plus. And then I'm going to be shoving hands like ace king, pocket aces, and then if I have the occasional pocket eights, then something like that as well. So we do go ahead and shove, and we get absolutely snap called by a very, very unlucky for us pocket 3s. Overall, their play is obviously absolutely fine. They're not going to bet the flop and then fold with their backdoor straight draw, and obviously a very clean 3 out as well. So this time it has gone pretty damn badly for us. So this is the first of 2 hands versus the same villain, and my reads on this player were that they were definitely a reg and they were definitely on the tight side. And you will see how this hand influences my decision in the second. So we open the button with king 10 offsuit, and villain goes ahead and cold calls the small blind. Now when regs cold call the small blind, I'm pretty much going to assume that they're calling quite close to the small blind GTO wizard cold call ranges, and those are going to be hands like pocket pairs and some like suited connectors, some ace 9, some ace 8 suited, queen jack, king queen, those kind of hands. So when I do see the call in the small blind and I see this board, I think versus the big blind, we do a lot better on this board, just given the nature of the offsuit combos that the big blind is defending. But when we do get called by the small blind, this is going to be a much worse board for us. Either way, king 10 here can go both ways. Having the king of spades is nice, so I do go ahead and bet this time. Villain calls, and we see a very high EV card for the in-position player in the jack of clubs. But the reason I say that is because we're just going to have more queen jack here. We're going to have pocket jack sometimes, and we're going to have the top end advantage as well. Particularly when OOP doesn't choose to check raise the flop as well. I think we retain a large advantage here. We overbet our combo. I think our hand is pretty much going to want to bet most of the time. There's some argument that we could be checking some king 10 back on the turn. And if we are going to do it, it would probably be a combo without a heart. So I'm indifferent between whether or not I'm betting or checking the turn. We see a very good card in the 8 of diamonds. The reason it is very good is that OOP here has no 10-9 offsuit, whereas in position is going to have 10-9 a decent amount, especially when they have a heart in their hand. We also don't have the king of hearts, which is a very, very good property for betting the river, because that allows OOP to have more call folds with king high flush draws. Now we need to think about our sizing scheme, and I think the sizing scheme here is just going to be 2/3 and all in. The 2/3 is going to be for maybe like low 2 pairs, hands like 4, 6, and then maybe a hand like pocket aces. I do think aces is definitely on the line here for the 2/3 sizing, but I think it's probably going to be fine. Now we also want to have our all-in sizing, and that all-in sizing is going to be purely built around straights, sets, and then good 2 pair. The good 2 pairs, I think the bottom of the value threshold here is going to be queen 6. If not queen 6, definitely queen 8, and obviously queen jack as well, and then a bunch of straights. So I think that with our exact combo, we don't have good properties here to go 2/3. Well, we do have good properties to go 2/3 because it is a bet and it's obviously way better than checking. But I do think our hand max EVs by using the all-in sizing. So I do shove the river for about 2x pot, and villain tanks all the way down to about 14 seconds. Before calling a pretty sus queen jack offsuit. I think this really demonstrates that the player type is definitely on the fearful and nitty side, and particularly in a spot like this where I think it's fairly obvious that they are value catching versus at least queen 8, but certainly versus queen jack for a chop. I think it's a pretty clear call on the river, but perhaps there are some exploit reads that maybe Paul doesn't bluff this line enough. Obviously, we have a premium bluff as well, so we can't even justify whether or not that is true or not. But this definitely does set up the dynamic for the next hand. So if there was a single hand that could sum up my experience on GG, this would absolutely be it. So we have pocket nines in the cutoff, and we are against the same villain from the last hand with the Queen Jack. They go ahead and defend the big blind. We see an extremely juicy 9-5-4 with a flush draw. Villain checks, and we decide to bet 2/3 pot. There are a number of approaches that you can use here. Half pot or pot are both okay as well. I just like to go 2/3 pot from the cutoff versus the big blind. Now, villain gets out the Omega phone in the pot sizing check raise. Now, I think ordinarily here, when people raise this big after we go big on the flop, we generally just want to be continuing with a call with our range. There'll probably be some 3-betting from very vulnerable overpairs like pocket 10s and pocket jacks. But I think against population here, you just need to be unbelievably cautious unless you're playing a very, very special VIP or a very, very aggro reg. However, we are not against any of those types of players. We are versus a very, very nitty player who doesn't like to put much money in the pot, as exhibited in the hand before. So I think actually calling the flop here would be a monumental error, because it's very likely that they have a combo draw, which they're not going to fold, or a set that if a straight or flush card rolls off, they actually may not end up stacking off. So we definitely want to make sure that we get in as much money with our unbelievable nut versus, well, let's be honest, what is their unbelievable nut too? Villain shoves, and I can tell you now, we are not surprised by this all-in. In a shocking turn of events, Villain does have pocket fives, and we do ask to run it twice, or we would have run it twice. However, Villain can see into the future because they do bang off the one outer on the turn. There is a chance, though, that we can make quads and also a BBJ at the same time. Small sweat, then I realize the 9 clubs is already gone, and we do lose the 2k pot versus quads. So in this super interesting hand, we are at a 2-5 with a $2 ante. So we do get an open from MP, and this reg is a pure exploit reg from what I can tell. And that doesn't mean that they're bad at all. On the contrary, I think that what they do in the pool is extremely, extremely good. And this player, yeah, I've got huge props for this player, given that they just don't seem to play like everyone else, and they seem to make it work really, really, really well. They do open 3.5x. Now, in terms of the opening ranges on these tables, I've seen such a wild diversity between the ranges that people are opening. So I can't really say too much about the pre-flop range, and that's why this hand is so interesting. With ace-10 of clubs, I'm going to be doing some 3-betting and some cold calling. I don't play cold calls in the cutoff at 100 big blinds on normal tables. So this is something I developed just at the ante tables because we need to be VPipping more because there's more dead money out there. Also, the recreational is behind, so cold calling can never be that bad. We have top 2 pair on ace 10 7, and I would like to see myself hyperpolarize the flop. I would like to see myself use an overbet sizing. For whatever reason, I do use a 2/3 pot sizing. Perhaps I was thinking that at the time I blocked the call so heavily, but that's no excuse really. I should just be going overbet on the flop. When villain calls and we see the 6 of spades bringing a flush draw and they check, I think that there's a relative symmetry in the 9-8 suited. I would say that OOP probably has a bit more. I don't think I'm going to be cold calling 9-8 suited always from the cutoff. I might 3-bet it sometimes. Particularly with the recreational behind, I will have it more often. I would be lying if I said I had it every single time. Whereas OOP has it sometimes. They also do c-bet it sometimes or check raise it sometimes. So perhaps there is a relative symmetry in the 9-8. When there's a symmetry in the nuts, you generally don't get to overbet all that much, and you're kind of usually capping out at around pot, and this is one of those times that I do decide to go pot. I think when I do pot the turn, I'm now excluding hands like ace-jack from my range, and I'm almost exclusively 2-pair plus. Hands like ace-7, ace-10, and then there's going to be some obviously very nutted hands, but that'll be the bottom. When villain pretty quickly calls the turn, I'm feeling pretty good about my hand. I think it's fairly unlikely that they have me beat. I guess there's some small chance that they have pocket 7s or pocket aces or something like that. Now, I've spoken to a few people about this hand since it was played, and my thinking in game was that I need to have 2 sizes for 2/3 and all in. The 2/3 was going to be built around hands like ace-10 and ace-7, but the thing that people called me out on here, which I think is a very, very good point, I don't really have ace-7 pre-flop much at all, and also ace-10 is literally 2 combos. That is such a small portion of my value region and bluffing region on the river when you compare it to my sets and straights. Those make up way more combos, 10s, 7s, and then there's going to be the straights as well. So that when I'm only using 2/3 pot for 2 combos in my range, it doesn't really make much sense to do it. So I should really be just using an all-in sizing here. Either way, I do decide that when I'm blocking the calling range heavily here, I just want to be using the 70% sizing. I think exploitably, this is probably just going to be absolutely fine. In-game, theoretically, maybe this is an error. Again, I have no idea, don't know what the sim says, so I'd be interested to hear what people think about this in the comments. Villain goes into the tank and super grimly and interestingly shoves. So what this boiled down to for me was I'm definitely not at the top of my range. I do have some 9/8 and I do have some sets. However, when I do have this exact holding and I'm using a 2/3 sizing, villain can definitely be shoving a set, I think. Probably hand like pocket aces on the river because I'm somewhat capped and I probably would be using my all-in sizing for my straights. There's also the flip side that if villain, who is a very competent opponent, assumes that I am capped with my bet sizing, then they have more incentive to start bluffing combos like 10-9, 8-7. I think a lot of these, even without flush draws, end up check calling the turn. And I think it's fair to say that it becomes relatively difficult to regulate those frequencies. You could then make another argument that when villain does have 8-7 or 10-9, then they do block my bet folds, which are going to be hands like sets. However, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be using the big sizing for my sets, and I'm going to be using the big sizing for 9/8 as well, which therefore does leave me rather capped when I go 2/3 pot. So I kind of leveled myself here that I was thinking that yes, there may be a few combos of 9/8. They did snap call the turn, though it makes those combos a bit less likely, but also there are going to be a number of other combos that could be incentivized into bluffing. All in all, I decide that this player was competent enough to bluff the river, so I do go ahead and long tank and call. And this time we have run into 9/8 offsuit, and the reason this hurts so much is that because I just don't know what ranges people are opening, you just can't attribute 9/8 offsuit to villain here. Obviously, in hindsight, if we know villain opens 9/8 offsuit here, we are never, ever, ever going to call the river. But if we think that they don't have those combos pre, then I think that in reality, this call is probably going to be okay versus what we're going to say, a normal range. But do let me know what you think about this hand. Super interesting, and I'm very, very unsure still. So that's going to do it for the hands, and I'm sure you may have noticed that this video is quite a lot longer than some of our other episodes because we won't have an episode next week for you. So let me know what you think about the slightly longer form content. Is it something you want more of, less of? Do let me know. But until next time, take care, and I'll see you at the tables.